Hello, my name is Rourke, and this morning we are going to walk through the book of Jude, specifically the textual criticism issue within verse 5 of Jude. So, to do that, if you can see the screen here, what we've got is my paper that I wrote for the textual criticism class that I'm in. And so we're going to walk through not only this paper, but primarily through the text itself to get a better idea of what we're dealing with here in Jude and what the textual issue is and what we think we should do with it in terms of what is likeliest the original likeliest to be the original variant and the preferred reading, therefore, of the text. So, without much further ado, let's go and look at this text. So, if you are with me, you can jump here with me. So, we go to verse 5. I'm going to read it in Greek first, and then I'll read it in English. So, in Greek, it says, um, hypon, hypomen, hypomese de himas, bulemai, idotas himas, hapax pantahoti Jesus, laon ekes, Egyptu sosas todeteron tus me pistevantas apolesen. All right, so it ends there. It's a little, haven't spoken much Greek this morning. It's been a bit of a slow morning, but as far as the text goes, it's pretty straightforward in that Greek construction, at least saying it. And we'll jump into those grammatical nuances here in a second. But in English, it says, "Now I want to remind you, although you came to know all these things once and for all, that Jesus saved a people out of Egypt and later destroyed those who did not believe." Ooh, dense. Book of Jude is a fantastical um, it's a fantastical letter within the New Testament. It's a very, very brief and short one, and so the fact that we have this textual issue is really, really important. And I think it's a good reminder to analyze even the seemingly simple and nuanced of things within the Bible, because it's just so cool to walk through these passages of Scripture as we get to break them down and get to learn more about them. So, jumping back over to this paper, I think as we walk through it, you'll get an idea of my focus for it. There's a question here as to the legitimacy of the text, and you can see back over here in Logos, if you look in verse 5, we've got this note here on Jesus, which is the Greek word for Jesus. And if we go to the apparatus here, and then this is the UBS 5th edition apparatus, and in the apparatus it says that this is a C grade textual variant. So what that means is there's A grades, there's B grades, and then there's C grades. A and B grades tend to be fairly confident inclusions for the committee. So A grade being, they have textual variants that are different from what is included in the critical edition of the apparatus of the text. And in their apparatus, they include the other textual variants, but they're pretty confident when it's an A grade. A B grade is like, okay, we're fairly confident, but they do a fair job, I think, of identifying, hey, here's what a good here's what represents what a high level with a high level of confidence what is true to the text, what is original to the text, versus B is less confidence, and C is significantly less confidence. So much so indeed that in the 4th edition of the UBS, it was actually different from what is listed here. So I believe in the 4th edition, and I could be wrong in this, but I believe in the 4th edition they go for the variant of hoti kyrios, which is listed here, right? So you've got these listings of the different variants then afterward, if you can see my cursor. And so it's important to walk through which of these textual variants it seems most likely to be original to the text. And so what do we mean by original to the text? We mean as we open up the critical edition, which is this collection of manuscripts that they've kind of parsed, that a group of people have parsed through to figure out what is the best representation of the original autographs, as we don't have any, as we know, we don't have any of the original autographs with us. But as they work through it, they give different grades to different portions of it, because they want to figure out, hey, is this is this truly original to the text, or is this something that was maybe added on later, or and they kind of parse and work through it. That's the job of textual criticism, is to say, hey, we have all of these variant documents, and which one is the original document? And so what is, like, can we get back to the original autographs? And so there's been some crazy discussion as to whether that is the true intent of textual criticism. I do believe that is the intent of textual criticism. It's to walk through the text in a way that we can try to get back to the original autographs and the original writings as they exist. Maybe we will. It's unlikely that we will ever find the original autographs or be able to even identify them as such, because we have so many copies of manuscripts at this point. But I think, again, this is less so a discussion on the reliability of the New Testament. I think the New Testament is extremely reliable, more so than any other document of antiquity. And with that, though, there's always some complexity that comes with it. And I think, honestly, this is God's way of demonstrating how we can learn more about His Word and how we can dive deep into His Word, and really parse through some of the unique and cool things within it. So that being said, we're gonna walk through this paper real quick, and there's three different. I want you to see in this contents. There's three primary variations to the text, and all of them have to do with who the subject of this sentence is, right? So is it Jesus? Is it Lord? Is it God? Right? So we see here, again in the English, we see. Now I want to remind you, although you came to know all these things once and for all, that Jesus saved a people out of Egypt and later destroyed those who did not believe. Right, so Jesus being the active agent in this sentence, right? So he is the active subject and active agent, right? And the direct object being the people of this clause, right? So again, clausal structure is, you have this first section here, right? That's that first clause, and then you have this transition to that Jesus saved a people, right? So this is this focus. So the question becomes: was it Jesus? Was it the Lord? Or was it God? And I think we're going to be able to walk through and kind of get a determination for what probably best represents the original text, and why, at least what I think best represents the original text based off of the evidence that I've compiled. So within that, kind of one of the interesting things about this passage and this verse specifically is scholar Bart Ehrman intentionally picks apart this passage and identifies this as an instance where scribes of the early New Testament intentionally wrote their theological perspectives into the text. Now, I think this is extremely wrong. I think it's an unfair approach to the practice of the practice of scribal literature, especially within the Christian New Testament. And so I think that is not something that is well characterized by this text. And I think as we'll walk through within my paper, you'll see there's a clear refutation of that within what I describe. So I introduced the topic and the subject here, and we spent some time in the introduction walking through that. I chose not to use a presentation to walk through this because I want you to see the collection of historical documents that we have to attest to this, and I think that's harder to do when you have a presentation. If I have a presentation, I can just kind of give you the bullet points, the quick answers, and we're going to go on a little bit more detail with this, and I think that's where walking through this paper would be helpful to just see that. So the question becomes, and first, as I identify in my introduction, we have to go through kind of two major focuses within this paper in order to get a good perspective for what is true to the text. The first is we're going to take the entirety of the external evidence and analyze it and determine what the external evidence says, whether there's a preferred variant that can be developed from it. And then we'll go into the internal evidence. And the internal evidence is going to be things like word usage, grammar, theological perspective, things like that help drive it's based off of what we would expect based off of the other writings of Jude, again, given that there are such a limited variety of such, what the other perspectives of Jude are, so that way we can incorporate that into our decision and understanding of what is truly, again, what is my perspective to be the original source, or the original variant included within the autograph. So to analyze the external evidence, I've split it up between these three variants. There is a fourth option, and it's a combination option. The difference being with that, and I don't go into too much detail in this paper about it, primarily because it's the length of it. It it would have taken too much away from the other three variants and the discussion on the other three variants to go into a combination description. But I think a combo could have been a possibility. But they kind of fall back into these other categories naturally if that's the case, right? So I think that's where, even though we have a quick discussion on it, I'm not spending too much time on it. So let's start with this first variant. This first, the one that the UBS 5 has decided to include within their critical edition, and that is Iesus. So external evidence for Iesus is extensive. When we say extensive, there are two key unseal codices, is the description, right? So the great unsealed manuscripts, which are those manuscripts that have all majuscule letters. So they're, instead of being lowercase letters and splitting up the words, it's all uppercase letters and they're all squished together. So really, really, even if you can read the New Testament in Greek, it's really tough because it doesn't look a lot like anything you learn in school. And except for the capital letters, right? And then there's also a lot of abbreviations with it. Um, there's just a lot within it that makes it a little tougher to understand and to read. But that being said, both Codex Vaticanus and Codex Alexandrinus attest to this version and this variant within the text. So that's really, really important because both Vaticanus and Alexandrinus, like I said, are great unsealed manuscripts. We'll go into dating a little bit here. Vaticanus, found by Constantine Tischendorf in 1843. Tischendorf, a great scholar and textual critic in history. He's the one who is accredited with, I think, the majority of discoveries when it comes to these manuscripts. I think the clear majority of discoveries. Maybe Chester Beatty, but Tischendorf is pretty much the guy who started it. He said, hey, he was traveling overseas in Egypt and he found a copy of a biblical manuscript and it just sparked something within him. And so Vaticanus, as we walk through Vaticanus, it was found by, like I said, found by Tischendorf. And there's a lot of similarities between Vaticanus and P75, which we'll talk about briefly here in a second. But it's one P75 is one of those combo options. But Vaticanus is of the Alexandrian text type, but it's of the Alexandrian text type, so it's closer to the Alexandria school and library. So there was a big emphasis on, even though across the Roman Empire, during the right, especially during the construction of the New Testament text and the copying of the majority of the early New Testament texts, Christianity was outlawed. But within Alexandria, there was a heavy emphasis on the preservation of information more so, and the ability to include that within the library. And so until the fire of the great Library of Alexandria, a lot of the documents were developed there, were copied there, and there was a school and class of thought within Alexandria. And so that's where we get this idea for Alexandrian text type. And so both Vaticanus, most scholars, you're going to see here, I've got lots of footnotes, lots of information on the different scholars that date it. Most of these scholars date back to the early 1900s or late 1800s. So these books on Vaticanus after their discovery in 1843 were extensively written on in the late 1800s and early 1900s. So most of these are going to be from that time period, but they date it. Dating leaves little room for debate, and it dates back to around the 4th century, so around the time between 3 and 400 AD. So that's the current estimate. So that would have been after, likely after the legalization of Christianity by Constantine. And so during that time, a lot of the great unseals were constructed and put together based off of the manuscripts that they had at that point. So those scribes and scholars are putting it together. And so that's generally when we have that. Definitely Alexandrinus, the other great unseal, one of the other great unseals, dated back to the 5th century. So a little bit later, about 100 years later. When it comes to early dating, both of these are later than we would find a lot of the other manuscripts, but both of them are fairly early when it comes to the age of the documents. So, and they're very, very well preserved. So they're written on parchment, not written on papyri. And so that's really, really important when it comes to preservation and the ability to read the text. Now that we don't We have the great majority of the New Testament, and more than just New Testament, we have a lot of the LXX or the Septuagint within them as well. But both of them, which are both Alexandrian, of course, Alexandrian, hence the name, right? Both uh, have this text variant within it. So again, the fact that they are within the same text family is not surprising. But you know, the fact that the Alexandrian text type does include it is important. So, interestingly, though, both the Ethiopic and Coptic Sahidic translations witness the inclusion of Jesus, right? So, that is a very the Byzantine textual tradition is what claims most of the Ethiopic witnesses, as I've written here. The Byzantine text tradition is not the same as the Alexandrian text tradition, and so the fact that there is some diversity already within the textual witnesses for this is important. Um, and so again, Coptic witnesses are included in the Alexandrian family, but it's important that the Ethiopic witnesses begins to introduce some level of and a high level of diversity within it. So, and then the writings of Origen and Jerome both include witness to Jesus. Not surprising here, both Alexandrian scholars, um, and so again, really not surprising when it comes to what is written in the text. So, I'm not going to spend much more time on Jesus. I'm going to jump now to Lord and Kyrios. So it's interesting as there were identified six different manuscripts that are included in this apparatus here um, from the UBS for the attestation of Jesus. There are nine different uh, manuscripts that include Kyrios, and that is important because of these nine, um, there are a couple of really important ones. So the Byzantine tradition and Codex Sinaiticus both offer attestation to that. So Sinaiticus is a very complicated textual document. And so it dates between the fourth and fifth centuries. Again, it's another one of those great uncial codices. And so when it comes to the differences between Sinaiticus and the inclusion of Sinaiticus in this textual type, it's really important. The other manuscripts, so both Sinaiticus and the Byzantine tradition include this. The Byzantine text tradition is mostly those minuscule documents. So it's a lot of the later dating minuscule documents that were either based off of a single translation, so again, largely Sinaiticus, and then developed then from that. Um, but a lot of those are later date, and so when it comes to the ability to witness to the originality of the text, the Byzantine witness doesn't offer a ton in terms of giving us a clearer picture as to what is more likely original, right? So just because we have more doesn't necessarily mean that it's a better witness, and so I think that's important to bring into account. So the last one we have here is Theos, so God, and so the question is whether or not Jude 5 sees a full like I say here, Jude 5 sees a full representation by every witness type when it comes to Theos. So that is the um, Greek manuscripts. That's going to be your lectionaries. That's going to be your early church fathers. That's going to be your early translations. Like every textual witness testifies to the use of Theos within the text. So I think that's important. I think that demonstrates not just diversity between the different variants, but an extreme diversity within this single variant. So that demonstrates a quick dispersion. I think that's really important beyond geographical regions. Of course, all of the what's interesting is this variant differs across both the same geographical regions and different ones. So geographical region in this scenario is not as much of a factor, which is very interesting because with most uh, textual issues, it's usually a deciding factor when it comes to we can see how this textual tradition developed in this pocket of the Middle East, and that's why it looks like this, or this is how it developed in Northern Africa, and that's why it looks like this, or this is how it developed in Europe, and that's why it looks like this. And so, because we have such variation between the three among the different groups and among the different geographical regions, I think it's really important, and it impacts how we understand this passage and understand this variant. But one of the other four uncial manuscripts, manuscripts in Ephraemi Rescriptus demonstrates support for this textual variant. Ephraemi Rescriptus is an interesting one. It's one of those really unique documents where the text was originally scratched off, and so but because of our ability to kind of look at the text and see it, there's still portions of it remaining. We can see that the entirety of the document was there to begin with. So that's what we call a palimpsest. So it was removed and replaced. And a framing offers a critical witness to the textual variant of Theos. And so I think it's really important that we recognize the diversity of the textual witnesses, and even the combination here. But as we evaluate the external evidence, I think what is interesting with this textual variant is that the external evidence for it does not provide much clarity on what would be preferable because of how widely dispersed the variants are between them, and how widely dispersed the variants are between the different documents and the different attestations of the text. It's really, really hard to use the external evidence to gauge whether or not there is a preferred reading or not. So again, that's why it's a C rating, right? That's why it's a tough one. But that's why we have things like internal evidence, and I think that's where we get a clear picture for what should be included. So when we look at internal evidence, the things we're going to look at are authorial style and context. So we're going to analyze Jude's authorial style and context, the theological considerations, the parallels with other passages, right? So both in Jude and outside of Jude, and and then we'll do a final evaluation. So before we jump too far into the final evaluation, I want to focus in here on authorial style and context. So it's important to recognize, and Metzger points this out in his commentary on the Greek New Testament. Jesus alone is is important to this passage. So he identifies that within the rest of Jude, every time Jude references Jesus, is always his full reference. So Jesu Christo, Jesu Christos, and so like that is important because the fact that he's using it here without Jesu Christo, according to the textual variant, um, you know, it's indicative potentially of the pattern within Jude. Now, notably, Metzger would prefer Jesus as the preferred reading, which is for him, he makes it on a textual criticism basis, right? So he says, hey, because it's the theologically harder reading, the theological implications of it, um, it's important to include it. I think that is important, and you're going to see here when I go down to parallels with other passages, I continue that discussion of of the usage of Jesus alone. And so I'm gonna analyze it I analyze it when it comes to other passages of scripture. Primarily, I look at Second Peter because of the parallels within their content. So Second Peter has a usage of Jesus without the subsequent Christos. So it seems plausible that um, if both are based off of a similar source document, or if one is based off the other, that this is not surprising. And so I think that that helps kind of deter the argument that Jesus alone would be surprising. And then further within this, both the Pauline epistles and the general epistles both use Jesus without a subsequent Christos approximately just over 21% of the time. And so I did a quick, easy analysis and statistical analysis to determine, hey, because it happens, based off this textual variant, if this textual variant is original to the text, happens once out of 5 times in Jude. Jude is a really, really small document, right? So if it is 1 out of 5 times comparable to its usage in these other documents, and what you find is that it's not only statistically significant, right, or implicative, but it's also it makes complete and total sense that it would only happen about once out of every 5 times. So that, especially again with the length of Jude, is unsurprising. And in terms of the other times, the number of times he references Jesus, and including Jesu Christo. So it shouldn't be that reason alone shouldn't be a reason to side with one particular variant over the other. But that's again more of an analysis of parallels with other passages and comparative, comparisons with other passages. When it comes to theological considerations, I think one of the important things is that Jude doesn't directly quote, unless some scholars consider his discussion in Jude 9 a potential quotation of the Old Testament, but instead he talks through Old Testament themes. And what's interesting is that it's always about the Old Testament themes and the implications that they have for Christology. So he does develop a heavy Christology within his book, and I think that is really really key to understanding the passage. I don't necessarily think that demonstrates the capacity for Jesus to be the preferred variant, because I don't necessarily see Jude Uh, reinterpreting these passages of scripture by injecting Christ into them. Now, I do see that you do see this with Paul. I think of Ephesians. I think of Ephesians chapter 4 specifically. And I wrote on this earlier this semester, but there's a portion of Ephesians chapter 4 where Paul quotes a psalm and then he directly interjects he into it. And so because the psalmist is writing to God, and the psalmist is saying you, and Paul interjects he when referencing Jesus, and so that is, and it's not uncommon for New Testament writers to to inject Christ into Old Testament passages, and so it wouldn't be surprising if Jude chose to do that. I think, but I think it would also move. I don't think you can make an argument for either scenario in this case. The other thing that I think is important to recognize is that because of the widespread variation within this text, Ehrman's claim that Scripture would have been intentionally corrupted for a purpose of theological unity or a desire to see the divinity of Christ somehow injected here again, as if it doesn't happen in other places. Like he ignores the places where it's Christ himself incurring his divinity in both, again, the end of Matthew, the end of Mark. You see it all over, and not just in John, as Ehrman would claim, but specifically within this passage. If the claim that Ehrman has is that, hey, these scribes have gone in and they've intentionally tried to change things so that way it demonstrates a divine nature to Christ that apparently wasn't there in the first place, then these scribes have failed miserably, because the fact that we have so many textual variants on this specific passage shows that if that was the intention, they did a really bad job. And so I have a higher view of these scribes, right? I know they're errant. I know they make mistakes. And so in this sense, like, I think they either made a mistake, um, an unintentional mistake, but I don't see them writing Jesus' divinity into this in a way that is done out of malice or malintent, right? And I think that's the important piece here, is that if anything, they had such a recognition of Christ's divinity within the text that for them to associate Jesus with God was unsurprising, right? So if they got a manuscript and they went to write a new copy of it, and they were to see that, it would not be surprising to them because of the numerous occasions where Jesus is, again, even self-described as God. And so I think that's really, really, really important to this passage, and understanding, hey, it's not a decision from these scribes to do something intentionally and in a wrong way. It's them going, hey, no, not at all. I think I think there's a much better explanation for how they may have made this scribal error. So, getting into that, within the evaluation of this internal evidence, I think the internal evidence drives ultimately um, the preference of either theos or kyrios, and that's mostly because of this potential scribal error that would have occurred, right? So the use of theos and kyrios in the Old Testament is extensive, and so when the Old Testament LXX describes God, it's almost it is exclusively using kyrios or theos. Kyrios especially more often than theos, but both are used fairly interchangeably for God, and to reference the God of the Old Testament. And so for this passage, if with an Old Testament reference, I think if we're going to be going based off of internal evidence and deciding based off of the most likely indication, I think more than likely either theos or kyrios were used. And if either were used, they would be interchangeable with each other, right? So we'd have theos and kyrios, and either seems interchangeable. and so if a scribe is writing and they see Kyrios and they write Theos, then that describes how Theos would have come up. If they see Theos and then they would write Kyrios, then that explains how those two variants would come up. And then from there, Kyrios was interchanged with Jesus all over the New Testament. And so an unintentional scribal error of I think the likely order of development would have been either um, that Jesus developed out of Kyrios. I think you could see again already knowing that Jesus is frequently understood to be God, and referred to in this way by using Kyrios by not just scribes but original authors consistently and persistently using Kyrios instead of to describe Jesus, intentionally conflating him with the God of the Old Testament, right? So they're intentionally um, uh, insinuating that he is the God of the Old Testament in the way that they do that. And so I think in that way, it wouldn't have been surprising if a scribe made an unintentional error and then all of a sudden it just becomes a more common variant because of that. And that's how it makes it into all of these different texts. And that also explains why there's such a diversity of textual witnesses to this. And so with that, I think it's really, really important to recognize that either of those seems like the preferred reading based off of the internal evidence. And so then we have to go back to, and this is what I discuss in my conclusions, we have to go back to the external evidence and go, okay, based off of the internal evidence, it seems most likely that one of these two options is likely original. So having said that, which of these two options presents the, based off of the external evidence now, the likelier option. So between the three, I think it doesn't specify one when it comes to external evidence, but I think if we reduce it down to two and we have to make a decision based off only the comparison of Theos or Kyrios, I think Theos I think Theos is more than likely the best attestation for originality within this textual variant. And the reasoning I have for that is because of the later development of Kyrios. So apart from Sinaiticus, the majority of the textual tradition is from the Byzantine text, which develops much later. And so again, even though Sinaiticus is earlier, the rest of the Byzantine tradition is based off of only a limited number of documents. And so, again, even though there's diversity among everything, I think given a singular option, having to pick between one or the other, that seems to me like the best option. And so, in my mind, I think that is probably the most original. Now, I also understand why they choose to use Jesus, given its harder theological reading. But I also don't think that that is the best way to determine what is original to the text. I think that is a way for us to go, okay, this I think it's a way for us as textual scholars and critics to excuse a potential variant introduction. And so if we can wrap our heads around a harder reading that's still theologically within the realm of possibility, right? So it doesn't violate any it would not be a violation of Christian doctrine to say that Jesus is God. And so therefore it makes complete and total sense for his inclusion to be the preferred reading when it comes to the text critical decisions that they make for critical editions. But I think when it comes to the preferred reading and when it comes to the original the express intent of textual criticism, which is to determine the original manuscript and the original autograph, I think in this scenario, I think the best one and the best representation of it would be Theos over the other two. So I hope this was helpful. Of course, these are all my bibliographic entries, plenty of them within this document. But I hope this was helpful. I hope this was a beneficial walk through this passage of scripture. And I think at the end of the day, the implications of it are the same no matter what, right? Like you've got a bunch of textual scribes, a bunch of people who associated Jesus with God and had no problem including him within the text and incurring that within the text. And so I think in that sense, our reflection on it today should be, hey, regardless of what um, the intended, or what the, regardless of what the actual um, variant that is original to the manuscript, the original autograph is, all three options ultimately produce the same conclusion, which is Jesus is Lord. He is coming home, and he's coming back for us. And at the end of the day, we can trust the scriptures based off of what they describe and ascribe to Jesus. And so I think that being said, that is the most important thing to remember. So thanks for spending your time with us, with me today. And thanks for walking through the text. It's been fun.